Welcome to another episode of Defending the Line. I'm Christy Shepard, and this is my podcast to share the story of what happened in the murder of my cousin Debbie Carter in our small Oklahoma town, and how finding out the men convicted of that crime were innocent turned into a quest for truth and accountability. So I've grown up with the looming dread of these murder trials and the aftermath they bring. And at this point, Peppy had lived without Debbie longer than she got to have her. So in a 24-year span, not only had we endured the murder of Debbie, but the exhumation of her body. Peppy had spent 2 trips in the psychiatric hospital. There were 3 first-degree murder trials with 2 death row convictions and 1 life in prison conviction. Then 2 DNA exonerations, 1 prison escape, 1 New York Times bestseller by one of the most famous American authors, and then countless media and news coverage. And now we be going into the 4th murder trial. So, still a few weeks before the trial was to begin, Peppy had not gotten any kind of call on a meeting or anything until one day she did. And she called to let me know that the special prosecutor had made it to town and that he wanted to meet with her. And she asked if I would go down and just be with her and be there for support. And I said that I would. And so we went there to the local district attorney's office, and the special prosecutor met with us, who had, he was the same one who had tried Gore the first time around. And he answered all her questions and kind of told her how things were going to go, and he talked directly to her, and I thought it went really well. Never really even, I don't remember that he even acknowledged that I was there, which was fine. But as we got up to leave, and we're exchanging goodbyes and thank you and nice to meet you and all that, he went to shake my hand and said, "Oh, and good luck with all that stuff you're trying to do." And I was really caught off guard. And the only thing I could really say was thank you. I didn't really know what to do. And I was just kind of stunned. But clearly, he was making it clear that he knew about the legislative efforts that I had been working on, and was pretty petty about not being happy about that. So on June the 12th of 2006, the jury selection began in the 4th trial. And the stage was set in the small, same windowless courtroom on the 3rd floor. And there would be no new evidence. All the players were the same, in their same positions. The death penalty was on the line again. Although our view from the cheap seats seemed to have a little different outlook this time. And that morning there for jury selection, and I didn't know he was coming, but John Grisham was sitting in the back row, and probably most people didn't recognize who he was. But for me, his presence brought a feeling of empowerment, I guess, that someone else knew the truth and knew some of the things that we had learned about. And soon the sheriff's deputies brought Gore into the courtroom, and this time his prison jumpsuit was gone, and he had on a sport coat and tie. And he took a seat with his attorneys at one of the large, wooden law tables. And I thought about, if that was the same table that Ron Williamson had flipped over during his trial. Because remember, this is my first time to attend one of the trials. And so this was, my first time being there. After lunch that same day, on the first day of jury selection, I caught John in the bottom of John Grisham in the bottom of the courthouse, and we were talking, and I was kind of like, well, what are you doing here? Like, are you the trial's starting? Are you gonna stay for the trial? And he explained that he was actually just in town to interview the district attorney, that he was going to extend that courtesy to him to try to answer for, some of the things that he had learned. And I was curious. I said, well, what did he say? And he said, well, it seems as though he has some selective amnesia, I guess. He doesn't really remember anything. Okay. And, again, I asked John if he was going to stay, and he said, my book is done. I could write volumes about this one story alone. And I understood, but I was disappointed, but I tried to remind myself that, he was telling the story about Ron Williamson and the tragedy of what had happened to him. But sadder still, the story of Ron and Dennis both were chapters in this story of what had happened to Debbie. And so the following week, on that next Monday, time would be rewound to December the 7th of 1982. And we would live in this kind of time warp for the next few weeks. And the special prosecutor gave his opening statements detailing the last few hours of Debbie's life and how she desperately fought, and how all her bruises were, the indication of, how she just fought to the very end of her life. And it was really strange for me because when one of the first witnesses was called, I was kind of taken back, and I don't know what I had expected, or even if I expected anything. And then this happened kind of with each one. And some of the first witnesses were people that were at the bar that night at the Coach Lot. And I remember them asking, about their personal lives and, where they worked and where they lived and all that kind of stuff. And I was really taken back about how they were all middle-aged. And I guess in my mind, because Debbie is forever captured in that time period, I guess I don't know, I just expected them to be at that, same way she was, I guess. But I couldn't help but wonder, what Debbie would look like and how she would have aged, or, if she would be married, or if she would have had kids, or even if she would still live in Ada. Those same witnesses began to discuss their first statements and how they were taken and if changes were made. And some noted changes that were in the margins of the original statements. But having seen some of those statements and the handwritten notes and the changes and the arrows and the pointing, and it was very difficult to sit and listen to these people talk about their statements and how it was just odd because so many of these have been changed and rearranged, but later on, Detective Smith took the stand, and I remember really noting in my mind how old and tired he looked. And he testified that they had gone back and, quote, redid Gore's statements because it seemed incomplete. And I thought about the transcripts that I'd read, in the civil suit, and it really made it hard to listen to his testimony because the original statement of Gore on December the 8th of 1982 was discovered in a file during the investigation of the civil suit, which came after 1999. I hope I'm not confusing with the dates. But in the margins of the statement is written, "Will you rescue her?" And, in quotes, kept asking her to dance. But no one would own up to who wrote those things on that statement. No one would take ownership of the handwriting. There was a lot of, I don't know, and I don't, back in the civil suit, a lot of, I don't know, and that's not mine, and I don't recognize it. And in the second statement of Gore's, that was the one that was presented in the trials for Williamson and Fritz. And that statement is undated. And so Gore's second statement places Williamson at the coach lot, bothering Debbie the night that she's murdered. And again, makes him the only witness that sees him there that night. And Smith really continued to downplay the difference between the two statements like it was not really any big deal. Pretty much just how he had done in the civil suit testimony. And during all of this, the DA had maintained that he charged Williamson and Fritz based solely on the report that was presented to him by Detective Smith and by the OSBA agent Rogers. But neither one of Gore's statements are in the table of contents in this report. And no one can answer why. So how would the DA have even known about these statements placing Williamson at the coach lot? He said that he only prosecuted him on the things that he was given. But those statements aren't in that report. But again, I don't know, and I can't answer that, and I can't speak to that, and I don't remember, and no accountability at all. I took notes all through the trial, and at times I would catch myself being really engrossed in the testimony or appalled at sometimes, and I would forget to write things down. But it came time for the testimony of the criminologist by the last name. His last name was Bevel. And he described his theory of the events that happened the morning that Debbie's body was found. And on a large screen behind him, there was, diagrams of her apartment and, where the couch was and the bed and where her body was found. And I remember him saying that he believed that the shampoo had been used as a lubricant for the ketchup bottle, and that the assault with the bottle must have happened after she died, because the shampoo bottle was placed on the bed that was not in its place, but placed upright standing on the bed, undisturbed. And so again, the shampoo bottle's on the bed and all this mess, but they never fingerprinted the bathroom. And there was a washcloth in her mouth, but they never fingerprinted the bathroom. And this Bevel goes on to discuss the staging and the chaos in Debbie's apartment and throwing off the investigators. And he testified that the perpetrator had stayed in her apartment for an extended amount of time with the body during all this staging, and described how the word die had been written on her stomach and the other words that were written on the tables and walls, and how long he must have been there with her. And so Bevel's description of the crime scene made me really think back to the interview that I had done with Detective Smith. And I just wondered how in God's name did they get all this wrong? And then it always played back, did they do it on purpose? Was it, it was just so bad. Because Smith had told me in that interview that they were always looking for more than one person because, the writings and stuff were plural. And he felt like that Debbie would have been able to fight off one person. And then seeing this criminologist describe all this and how the evidence that's actually there lays out doesn't fit Smith's theory at all. And none of what he told, what Smith had told me made sense. And he just got it wrong. Just completely got it wrong. After Bevel had done his testimony, the judge called for a break. And we knew what was coming next. And that was the crime scene photos. And so we were asked to leave the courtroom. And, we all filed out. And so during this break, another cousin of mine who's my age, she and I were talking, and we decided that we really wanted to be back in the courtroom when they showed the photos, but that we talked about how we would sit by the door where the jury couldn't see us, and that way, if we needed to excuse ourselves, we could, and the jury wouldn't know that we had been in or out of there, because people were coming in and out the entire time. And so we felt like we should tell the prosecutor, I don't know why we felt we needed to tell him, but we did. And we told him that we were going to be in there. We wanted to see what, more of the description of what this Bevel was talking about. And he became so mad. And I don't know, this man is well over 6 feet tall. And I'm not quite 5 feet tall. And he completely bent at the waist and got nose to nose with me and said, "No, you're not. You are not going to be in there. I can't afford a mistrial. You're not going to be in there." And he was like, "If you want to look at those pictures, you go across the street and you look at them all you want to." And we were both just speechless. We could not believe that he would talk to us that way. I was just shocked. And it wasn't anything about wanting to see the crime scene photos. This had been so screwed up and so messed up. We were trying to understand how this all fit together. It didn't have anything to do with wanting to see those photos. If I knew then what I know now, one, I would not have said anything to him, but two, I would not have just stood there stunned either. To this day, it kind of blows my mind how he treated us. So we didn't go in. Sometime later in the trial, an investigator with the district attorney's drug task force had testified about an interview that he had conducted with Gore while he was still in prison prior to Ron and Dennis getting out. And this is that interview that I was talking about in a previous episode, where he goes back and forth and, it's just kind of coy at times. And so it's that interview. And maybe it was just the therapist in me, I don't know, but I could not help but really analyze and weigh out all the things that Gore wasn't saying in this interview, and how, he seemed to be really fishing for a way to blame the district attorney as to why his DNA was found in Debbie's apartment. And he seemed to struggle with the narrative of how he could work all that out and still, keep himself off the hook. But on the other hand, considering what I'd learned about Debbie's case, Gore's comments about the district attorney threatening him to implicate Williamson, or that he would, quote, "better hope you weren't there," that seemed plausible too. Because at this point, I didn't really give much credit, one credit over the other. Later on in the trial also, there was newspaper articles that came out all during this time. And the newspaper articles had reported Gore's escape, back in 1999, with really a slight sliver of truth. Because what we had learned in this fourth trial, with the testimonies of, Miss Flores and a few others, was that Gore had this scheme going with a city employee who was overseeing the prison workers. Miss Flores stated that she and Gore had been friends for several years and that she often visited him at his work site. And on the day that he had, supposedly escaped, in reality, he left with his girlfriend, Miss Flores. And at first they went to McDonald's for breakfast and then on into Oklahoma City. And while they were in the city, they went to Sears at a local shopping mall and were shopping for washing machines, and they paid bills. Flores explained that Gore had a pager where he would receive messages that day that he, quote unquote, escaped to call his boss. And that later, Gore left with someone she didn't know, and that she didn't hear from him again until the next day. And I'm certain that during this part of the trial, my mouth was hanging wide open. I remember I kept glancing at Peppy and other people, probably with this look of astonishment, that surely I wasn't hearing this right. That this could not be really what had taken place. That he just casually was shopping with a girlfriend when he was supposed to be on work duty in prison for violence against women. How did these people continue to make the unthinkable worse? And how did they continue to defend the undefendable? Just blew my mind. Years after this trial actually ended, and it took many other interviews and reading the first trial transcripts in addition to comparing notes and notes that I had taken, in Gore's second trial, I really got a better idea of what had transpired that day. And so what I learned was that Gore, who usually wore prison attire to work, that day somehow obtained street clothes from someone, no one knows who, and left with Miss Flores. And this alleged scheme that he was in with a city employee involved drugs and other favors. And that day that Gore received 2 pages from someone alerting him that there was a journalist and a producer who were waiting for his return at his worksite. So somehow, after he left Miss Flores, he acquired a state vehicle and ditched it somewhere between his return to the Ada area. And yes, you heard me correctly, a state vehicle. So within 14 months after Gore's great escape, that same city employee that had been alleged to have be involved with was arrested and then sentenced to prison on drug-related charges. So after reading the transcripts of Gore's interview and now watching his mannerisms for almost 2 weeks during this trial, I really could imagine what he sounded like, though I'd never heard him speak. And every time his attorney's assistant spoke to him, he would really lean in and he would rub his hand up and down her back. And it just repulsed me. And I watched him take notes during his trial, and he wrote with his left hand. And I thought back about those diagrams that Mr. Bevel, the criminologist, had showed, and how most of the wounds that Debbie had endured on her face were on the one side. And it made me wonder if whoever had hit her over and over was left-handed. So After, again, analyzing and searching for bits and pieces of the truth, I thought about those misspellings on the walls and on her table that don't come looking for us or else. And it made me think too about how the 4 in 4, don't come looking for us. The 4 was spelled Fore. Kind of how close to how he spelled his last name. Later in the week of the trial, it came time for the DNA expert to take the stand. And we really got a quick, lesson in DNA 101 and how the evidence matched Gore. And the experts testified that 5 of the 17 original hairs that were matched to Williamson and Fritz matched Gore. 16 of the 17 excluded Fritz and Williamson, and that 1 was inconclusive. But later on, that was found to match neither Williamson or Gore. To match Williamson or Fritz. Some that were originally microscopically matched to Williamson and Fritz were revealed through DNA that they were Debbie's. So some of those that they said matched Williamson and Fritz that they had at that time to compare to Debbie's, they didn't get those right. But through DNA, they were found to be hers. And the semen was found to match Gore's DNA. And there was other discussion about how the semen was likely only hours old due to how the sperm was intact. So the trial, was handed over to the jury some days later, and they deliberated for about 6 hours and came back with a guilty verdict. So for the second time, he was found guilty of Debbie's murder. And it came to the sentencing portion of the trial, and we listened to a woman who had dated Gore previously to Debbie's murder take the stand, and how she described in detail how he had raped and assaulted her. And we listened to Gore's ex-wife take the stand, and how he kidnapped her and her 3-year-old daughter, and how he stalked her and held her and her daughter hostage and shot at the police and raped her. And the testimony of 2 other women were read into the record, each detailing the rapes and assaults that they had endured at him as well. One of them described the rape that it had taken place in front of her 4-year-old son. And this was all testimony the jury, couldn't hear during the earlier parts of the trial. But I watched their faces in horror when these women described what had happened to them. And again, the jury was excused to deliberate his fate and whether or not he would get the death penalty. And we walked outside that day, and for pretty much this whole 2 weeks, me and Peppy and another aunt of mine had sat over by the county jail, and there was a little old wooden bench that was in the shade that was under the roof, and that's where we sat at every break in the mornings before trial or wherever. That's where we sat every day, because there was the area for the jury to sit in, and then Gore's family was sitting in another area. And as we waited that day for the jury to come back with their sentence, once again, we were approached by a victim coordinator who said, you know, I'm really sorry to have to ask you to do this, but you're going to have to move. We can't have you sit here. And we were kind of like, oh, okay, like, did we do something wrong? Or, you know, we weren't talking to jurors. We weren't talking to anyone. We were just waiting. This is where we've sat every day. And she informed us that there at the end of where we were sitting, kind of on this porch area, there's a big glass door that had bars on it, and it was very tinted. You couldn't see inside. But she let us know that Mr. Gore was just on the other side of that door, and he could see us. And he didn't want to have to look at us. So we needed to move. So we did. We, again, were kind of blown away and just picked ourselves up and actually had to walk completely on the other side of the courthouse to find anywhere that was in the shade to sit, because it was the end of June. And that day we continued to wait on the jury and wait and wait. And 5 o'clock passed. And as 5 o'clock passed, more family started to show up at the courthouse and gather, and we all just kind of stood out on the lawn and talked. And pretty soon daylight turned to dark, and we were still waiting. And about 10 and a half hours after the jury was deliberating, they came back that they were deadlocked on the issue of the death penalty. So about 2:25 in the morning, Judge Landreth took the decision from the jury and called us back into the courtroom. And as we watched the jury file back into the courtroom, we could see that they were tired and angry, except for one. And she was a kind of a young, dark-headed girl, and she was visibly upset, and her face was splotchy and red where she had been crying. And I was pretty sure she was probably the holdout vote on the death penalty. So the judge sentenced Gore to life without the possibility of parole. And that was it. And a week after Gore had been found guilty for the second time, Detective Smith, who had been in charge of Debbie's case, he dropped dead of a massive heart attack checking into a hotel on his vacation. It just seemed like a strange ending to it all. So I wanted to answer another question, and this one is from Dawn. And she said, do you feel like the Brady Law was the most beneficial and possibly the only legal way that Williamson and Fritz would have ever had a chance to be free? And what she's asking about is, I guess what most call a Brady violation. And it's what happens when prosecutors in a criminal case fail to perform their constitutional duty to turn over helpful evidence to the people that have been charged with crimes. So everyone has the right to due process and a fair trial. Because of that, when the government has evidence suggesting that a person is either not guilty or deserves a lower sentence, the prosecutor has an obligation to disclose that evidence. And it's often called the Brady Rule, which is from a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1963 called Brady versus Maryland. And to answer Dawn's question, I would say yes, that from the cases that I've seen, certainly in Debbie's case, Brady was a huge part in getting a new trial for these men. And so I looked it up, and Brady violations happen in about 55% of all exonerations. And in more than 72% of those are murder cases. So in the next episode, we'll talk about my reluctance to the idea of becoming an advocate and the backlash of Mr. Grisham's book. So feel free to send your questions, and again, I'll do my best to answer them in a following episode. You can go to defendingtheline.com for other information updates, as well as Defending the Line on Instagram. You can also watch these episodes on YouTube at Defending the Line. And as always, I thank you for listening.